I see lots of friendly faces here, so I know that a lot of you are familiar with the work that we do, but I'll start just with an introduction to myself and my background and what Global Wordsmiths is, and then I do have just a short PowerPoint presentation to walk through this concept of language justice, which is really what my organization exists to advance. So my background is that I'm a trained Spanish translator and interpreter, and I worked in the field here in Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania for about 15 years, all said and done, as a home visitor interpreter. So my job was to drive all over a 5-county area and go into people's homes and sit on the floor and interpret for families and children during early intervention home visits and social work home visits and things like that. So I got a really unique look at what it means to be somebody who doesn't speak English in a place like Pittsburgh that has really no infrastructure to support that. Eventually, I sort of started staying after appointments to help people read mail and fill out applications, or to help people make phone calls, to set up appointments. And then eventually I started going with people to those appointments to volunteer as an interpreter and make sure that they were able to access services. And I don't regret that one bit. I know now as a seasoned professional that I didn't have any boundaries back then. And one of the big important things about being an interpreter is boundaries. But at the time, I was more of an advocate, I think, for the families I worked with. And I really got frustrated that I was the one doing all the work, right? I was like, well, why aren't the hospitals providing interpreters? Why is it me? So I started yelling at people, which didn't work. I would go into hospitals and just be like, you have to provide interpreters for people. And that didn't get me anywhere. And so I ended up, taking a few steps back and just really starting to think about the systemic issues with language accessibility, right? Like, why is it that hospitals aren't providing this service? So that's kind of where the genesis for my organization started. And, myself personally, I live and breathe language access every day. I'm the founder and director of Global Wordsmiths. I'm also an adjunct faculty lecturer of translation technology at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm the co-chair of the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition, which is a coalition-based advocacy group across the state of Pennsylvania that works to advance justice and equity for immigrants and refugees in our state. So really this work is something that I'm super passionate about, and I'm so lucky to get to do the thing that I love as a job every day. And I love talking to people about language access and language justice and what those things mean, because I think that by and large, language accessibility is kind of an afterthought for service providers, or people might assume that, if there's a bilingual staff member that can help with language, that is sufficient for communication. But really, interpretation, translation, language services are so much more complex than that. And today, the goal of this short presentation and workshop is just to talk to you all about, empathy and what it feels like to be an English learner in a place like Pittsburgh that, really just doesn't have supports in place. So I'm going to start a little PowerPoint presentation, but I don't want this to just be me talking at you guys for 45 minutes. So please use the Q&A feature, use the chat box, ask questions, put your hand up, and even just interrupt me at any moment. I really want this to be a discussion and not just a one-sided presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share this little thing. Can everybody see? Can everybody see my slides here? Yeah?
Yeah, it looks great.
Oops. Nope. All right. So defining language justice, right? This is the topic of today's workshop. You'll hear me use the terms language access and language justice kind of interchangeably. And I think that really they kind of create and define each other. They're sort of one and the same. Language access broadly just kind of refers to access to supports like translation, and interpretation for English learners or what we call limited English proficient individuals. But language justice takes a little bit further and talks about the civil right to language access that exists under United States federal law, and about what it means for people to have equitable access to services that they need to survive and to thrive. And so, you know, I think a good place to start the conversation is just, you know, what language access is. And broadly, it's just what you achieve whenever individuals who have limited English proficiency, or LEP, can communicate effectively with you or your program, your staff, and participate in all of your different programs and activities. It's a term that LEP, rather, is a term that is used in the legal definitions, that is used in all the government literature about limited English proficient individuals, but I much prefer to use the term English learner. There's a growing movement also of people who use the term English learner, or sometimes people will say multilingual learner. And I think this is important to distinguish because LEP, or limited English proficiency, really focuses on a deficiency, right, inherently. We're talking about people being limited, right, or not proficient when we use that term. And that can create a bias rather than communicating positively about your subject's strengths, right? So this can kind of cause the narrative to really assume that English learners are, quote, needy or vulnerable or somehow lacking, when really they are capable human beings who don't need us to speak on their behalf. They just need to have equitable access, right? And so since immigrant and refugee communities are often sort of lumped together and viewed in this way as like unfortunate or vulnerable or marginalized, little things like this, like the way we talk about people, matter. Because even as well-meaning advocates, I think it's easy to fall into the trope of sort of thinking of people as helpless or as needing to be saved. But like I said, really they just need access, they need equity, they need justice, right? And so this is where the root of language justice comes from. So that's where this question starts. What is language justice? It's checking our own thought patterns in the work that we do as advocates, in the services that we provide, in the legislative work that we advance, and just, you know, stopping to think about the English learners as individual human beings and not as like this nebulous group that needs saved. So it's a procedural term when we talk about language access. It's a legal term, it's a set of best practices, it's policies, but language justice is social justice. It is human, equitable access to the services that people need to thrive. It's integration, it's leveling the playing field, and it's a shared responsibility that all service providers have. It's actionable, it's urgent, it's vital, and it's not an afterthought where I think so many people categorize it. So I'm going to ask for your participation now. If you can unmute yourselves and start shouting out. I really want us to think about what it means to be an English learner in this country, and more specifically in a city like Pittsburgh. So I'd love to hear from all of you. If you can say out loud, share with the group, brainstorm, throw it out there, any situation or service in which you think that language might be a barrier, right?
Hello?
Oh, hello? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. So just, you know, what are everyday services that you need or that you use that you think might be difficult to access without language support? You know, just shout out, deep dive stuff. So like, don't just say healthcare, but be specific, you know, mental health services or prenatal healthcare or reproductive healthcare, for example. Who's got one? There's some hints on this slide.
Finding a job.
Finding a job, absolutely. Career services, resume workshops, access even to applying, being able to interview, having the confidence to put yourself out there, right? For sure, professional services is a good one.
Taking the bus.
Taking a bus, yes. Especially in a city like Pittsburgh that's so segregated geographically and culturally. Being able to utilize public transportation is a huge barrier for people that have limited English access, because especially when you layer in things like using a Connect card or a transfer, or anything that's not super direct, it just makes people really afraid to go on a bus because they might get lost or they might not know what to do. And so what ends up happening is that people stay isolated in their little neighborhoods and in their little blocks. What else?
Opening a bank account.
What's that?
Communicating with emergency services such as 911.
Emergency services, yes. Public safety, police, EMT, first responders. And this one is huge because that tends to be a relationship that's already strained. I think authority and authoritative figures can be very intimidating, and there is an absolute power dynamic that exists there when you're talking about immigrants and refugees, especially within Latinx communities and refugee communities. So, there's already a barrier there to access. And when you layer in the English, it's very unlikely that people are going to reach out and utilize public safety and health services when they need them. And we know, there's data to support the fact that this makes our entire region less healthy, less equitable, and less safe. What else? A few more.
I think attending a networking event or conference in your industry.
Yeah, networking, traveling, going to conferences, and being able to communicate freely. Absolutely. And this is something that affects all aspects of people's lives, right? And that's kind of why I like to talk about it in these terms, because it's not just being able to read labels. It's not just, being able to figure out how to take the bus. It's something that really permeates into professional development and into public safety and health. And we know that outcomes are poorer overall with limited access to these resources. So
Communicating with your kid's teacher?
Absolutely. Education is a huge one. Communicating with your kid's teacher, but also enrollment and helping your kids with their homework and understanding the correspondence coming home about field trips and, PTA issues, and being able to talk to your school's administrators about behavioral issues or about attendance things that in some cases become legal issues. Really, it effectively cuts people off entirely from their children's education, which definitely has poor outcomes for the kids themselves and also for school districts and for the region at large. But it's not just elementary education. It's access to continued adult education, enrollment in university, understanding the academic processes here. It kind of elevates, or it kind of embeds itself in all levels of a person's ability to advance oneself educationally. So that's absolutely a great example. And really, we see the medical example here. It's not even just going out and making appointments. It's not being able to understand the health insurance system, not being able to renew your CHIP or your Medicaid or your medical assistance because it's very complex. Not being able to schedule an appointment, right? How do you make an appointment with a pediatric dermatologist if you don't speak the language? Going to the appointment, understanding what's being said to you. A lot of the times, doctors and service providers will use children to interpret for parents, which exposes the children to information that they're not emotionally or intellectually capable of interpreting. And it also leads to situations like, if you are seeing an obstetrician and talking about family planning, which is already kind of a sensitive topic for you, and there's a doctor talking to an interpreter or a bilingual volunteer about you rather than talking to you, that's really going to alienate that patient. And the chances that that patient is going to ever show up again are pretty slim. And it's not just the service. I've had in my career, I've seen several times birth certificates will be incorrectly filled out by the social workers in hospitals after moms give birth, right? So like imagine that you are like a Swahili speaking mom and you've just given birth and you've been up all night and you're exhausted, and somebody walks in your room and says, do you understand English? And you think you do, so you say sure, and then they ask you questions about your demographic information, about what name you want to give your child, about your address and your personally identifying information, and then 6 weeks later you get a birth certificate in the mail that's incorrect. An example for this was a dad whose name was Roberto, and the birth certificate came back that said, you know, rather than Roberto Jimenez, which is not the real name, I just made that up, it said Rob as the first name and Erto as the last name, which, you know, it's a funny anecdote when you talk about it in this context, but if you don't have access to language or aren't a citizen, you know, it's really almost impossible to get that document changed, right? You have to sit on hold for hours. You have to go downtown and get a certified copy of your birth certificate. You should really go through a lot. And if you're undocumented, you know, now you're in a situation where you have a precarious immigration situation with no legal proof that your children belong to you. And so it's a whole spectrum of consequences that can happen.
There's also the issue of access to information that's in print.
Absolutely. Yeah, translated materials, especially what we call vital information.
Yeah.
Which is something that we'll touch on a little bit, which is basically that, you know, there's a difference between translating a reminder for an appointment using a professional translator versus translating epilepsy medication instructions for an infant, right? There's a whole spectrum of consequences with that too. And, you know, the thing as service providers and as advocates is that it's not our job to decide which information merits being translated professionally or interpreted. It's just our job to do the right thing, right? And to provide language services, especially when we're legally required to do so. So one of the things my organization does is we tell people what those obligations are, and we advocate for language justice, and we train hospital staff and social workers and local governments about how to work with interpreters and what language access is and how to implement this. We also do a lot of consulting to help people build language access, you know, procedures and policies. So really, you know, that's why we talk about language access being social justice and equity and integration, because it's the sum total of all of these little boundaries that you can't get over that makes people withdraw, and it makes people not integrate, and it keeps people in their communities as opposed to bringing people together. So thinking of it in these terms rather than just a band-aid or a reactionary thing, I think is really important when you have the discussion about language services. So some other ones that, you know, didn't come up or may have come up are in this slide. You may or may not have already shared these, and this is just like a really abbreviated look at what it's like to navigate life as an English learner. And because it is so hard to access all of these services one by one every single day, English learners are exhausted, right? This can cause people, like I said, to withdraw. And as a result of that, a lot of people don't even attempt to access these services anymore. They become harder to reach in communications, especially in emergency situations. And it turns into this kind of feedback loop that really affects outcomes for everyone, not just those who are most affected by language isolation. So this is what language justice means. It's fighting hard to break that feedback loop. And by leading and doing the hard work of building language access infrastructure, right, in a place that doesn't have it to begin with. So with that being said, language access is also the law. There are three main legal precedents that are important here, because sometimes when you're talking to funders or decision makers, they understand why it's the right thing to do to provide language accessibility services, but they aren't necessarily compelled to act based on the social justice portion alone, for a number of reasons, right? Like limited resources, a lack of support at higher levels. And there are ways to advocate for language accessibility measures, communicating value and urgency with these decision makers that are all around, like all the advantages, the economics of it, why, for example, it's way cheaper to provide interpreters so that you don't have high emergency room waits in hospitals and things like that. But sometimes you need to bring out the big guns and tell people what their legal obligations are. So the three main pieces of legislation that mandate language access accommodations are Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Executive Order 13166, and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And I'm happy to share this slide and these slides with anybody afterward if you'd like. You can just reach out to Emily and I'll get them to you. So from a purely legal perspective, I like to think about this in the context of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So obviously, being an English learner is not the same as having a physical or mental disability, but the legal framework is a really interesting comparison. Both of them are federally mandated, and the problem set is similar. So for example, if you are a member of the deaf community and you go to a hospital, you will immediately be accommodated with an interpreter. But if you're that same Swahili-speaking mom that we talked about earlier, at the same hospital, it will be much, much more difficult to get language accommodations, if even at all. So this is because there's already a culture of accessibility and of legal enforcement around the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in 1990, when the ADA was newly enacted, we were fighting the same fight to convince hospital administrators and local governments why things like wheelchair accessibility are a thing and why ASL interpreters are required and how to create accessible spaces. So understanding language justice, language access, and the legal basis for both are sort of the first steps in advancing a culture of language accessibility in our communities, in our governments, in our own organizations. And, like one comparison I like to make is that you wouldn't advise a hospital to put plywood over a staircase and call it a wheelchair ramp. So similarly, we should rather learn and help others learn that, for example, children shouldn't be used as interpreters, or, the bilingual nurse on Unit 3 should not be brought in to interpret when they're not qualified to do so. So I want to wrap up the presentation part of this by doing a little guided discussion about what it really feels like to be an English learner in the United States, in Pittsburgh. And then afterward, we can have a discussion, we can do a Q&A, and we can get into the fun happy hour portion of this workshop. But for now, I really want you guys to take a minute, maybe while I'm talking, to think about an experience or a time in your life when you didn't feel like you had a voice, or you didn't feel understood, or like you were able to communicate and it was hard or difficult in some ways. So it can be something funny, like, when I tell my kids to put their shoes on like 90 times and they just don't understand me, or it can be something intense, like getting lost in a foreign country. It doesn't really matter. What I want to get at is how the experience made you feel, right? So my example is when I freshly went to Mexico City when I was younger, I was at a party and everybody in Mexico City speaks really fast and it's very slangy. It's kind of like New York City English, right? And I was really struggling and I was embarrassed and I wanted to tell people that I was embarrassed. So I kept walking around telling people that I was embarazada, which actually means pregnant and not embarrassed like I thought it did. And so I'm walking around this party and I'm telling everybody that I'm pregnant. And they're like, okay, whatever, lady. And everybody was kind of laughing at me. And eventually we figured it out. And somebody, was like, hey, that doesn't mean embarrassed. And everybody had a good laugh. And so that's the experience. But, when I talk about how it made me feel, even though I was able to laugh at myself, it made me feel embarrassed and it made me feel ashamed and it made me feel other and excluded and just kind of like dumb, right? Like the dumb American. And so when you share your stories, you know, I really want to talk about what feelings they gave you. So if anybody is willing to share, I'd love to get at least 2 or 3 stories just to kind of start this conversation. And I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
I can go. My story is stupid.
No, it's not stupid.
France for an art history class. I was very fortunate to be able to attend it. It was like my last 3 weeks of college, and I was like, fine, I'll just do something fun for the last 3 weeks. And so, yeah, it was an art history class. We went out on the town in like Avignon, and we went to a bar, and all of us were young, and all of us had no idea what we were doing, and it was very loud because it was a bar. And I tried to order a beer, but I wasn't familiar with any of the like European beer names or anything. So the bartender was like trying to say like, what do you want? And I was like, je ne sais pas, qu'est-ce qu'il tu favorite, or whatever. Like I was trying to like patch together like, what's your favorite beer? I'll drink that. And the guy finally just gave up. He just like poured a random beer. He gave it to me. And then I was like, how much? And he was like just take it and get out of my face. I felt like a dumb ditzy girl because I was talking to him at basically the same like level of language as a 6th grader, or not even 6th grader, a 6-year-old. And I was confused about what I was ordering. I was, you know, I had to repeat myself a lot of times. I felt flustered. I felt like giving up several times. And then ultimately I felt like really guilty and just sort of like threw random amounts of money at him because like I didn't want to just like get a free beer from this strange man. But yeah, that's my stupid story.
Yeah, and I'm sure even telling that story makes you feel like, oh, that was the worst, right?
Well, because there's also the gender stereotype undertones that are in there too. Like,
absolutely, yeah. Like when you said dumb ditzy girl, like I cringed because like I feel that and I understand that, and it really gets at the heart of like what this means to people, right? Like we are hardwired as humans for connection, right? And when we're not able to achieve that, and when we feel left out of that socially, it's emotionally disturbing, right? It's not just hard, it's awful. So thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else have one?
I have one. So I just finished my master's, and actually I did the same program as Emily, and we had to take a lot of technology classes.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. And I try to expand my technology horizons on many occasions, and took courses where, you know, people had undergraduate degrees and CS and years of experience. And I was in a class where everybody was way far advanced than me. And I wanted to ask a question, but I was like, I don't even know how to ask this question because I don't want to look stupid. And I don't really know if what I'm saying actually makes sense.
And that's like a helpless feeling or a powerless feeling, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, go on.
Oh no, I mean, I ended up asking one of the students in the class because I felt more comfortable asking a peer than asking the professor.
So would you say it made you feel uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah.
The whole experience?
Yeah, very uncomfortable. And it made me feel like I just needed to know more. So just kind of stressed.
Definitely. Yeah, it is stressful. And when it's every day, all the time, it's like this toxic stress that accumulates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. How about one more? Anybody else? Okay. Well, just in that short conversation, oops, sorry. I didn't mean to stop sharing. There we go. Even just in that short conversation, I wrote down embarrassed, ashamed, other, dumb, unwelcome, helpless, powerless, uncomfortable, stressful, ditzy, dumb, stupid, confused, flustered, want to give up, and guilty, right? And that was just from 3 people telling short little stories about experiences that didn't even really have like super high stakes, right? A lot of the times when I do this exercise, I get words like fear, isolation, dehumanized, anger, withdrawn, exhausted, hard, hopeless, invisible, unworthy, incapable, misunderstood, lost. People talk about depression and anxiety, worry, being unwelcome, being unwanted, frustrated, alone, or stigmatized. So this is every day. All of those services that we talked about 3 slides ago, going to the doctor, making phone calls, riding, public transportation, enrolling in school, every single thing in which communication is needed. If you don't speak English in a place like Pittsburgh, all of these feelings are how you feel every time you attempt to do any of those things, right? And so that's what it means to not have access. And I think that rooting conversations about equity and about language justice and about accessibility in this kind of empathy is really important to start this conversation. So that is the end of my PowerPoint. Am I still sharing my screen? No, I'm like a very incapable person sometimes with technology. Okay, so does anybody want to talk about what I just said about the presentation? Because that's what I've got for you in terms of me talking at you. But I think this is like a really new subject for a lot of people, and most people, like I said, don't really think about language access as being a thing. So if you would like to ask me questions or share experiences that you've had about language access or language justice, or make any kind of commentary about this subject at all, I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences, and just get a feel together for how this affects you in your careers and in your everyday lives. And no pressure.
If I may.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was doing something before, so I didn't have my camera turned on earlier.
No worries.
One important thing I think is good to remember when we're talking about specifically immigrants here in the United States is that like all the experiences that we as Americans have abroad is often not the same as an immigrant coming to the United States, especially when we travel to like Europe and such, because of our position in and privilege that we have. People often are willing to bend to make accommodations for us. But here in the United States especially, there's an intolerance to people who don't know how to speak English well, and the thought that you should be speaking English, and that is often mixed with race and class and gender. And so I think we have to be even more cognizant of that, because when we travel abroad as Americans, there is a certain privilege that comes with it, and people will bend to us, whereas here in the United States, you're more likely to get slurs thrown at you. So I've experienced this from both ends. I lived abroad for 2 years. I learned a new language, but I'm also the daughter of immigrants. And so I see how my parents have been treated here in the United States. And it is 2 entire worlds apart. And even when I faced racism in other countries and abroad, there was always still that not as bad as it could have been because I am American. And so I think that's something that we all really have to be very cognizant of, and to give people that same courtesy that they gave us while we were abroad, and really do our best to understand others and not put the onus of understandability on the person who's doing their very best.
Yes, I love that you said not putting the onus on the English learner, because it's not their responsibility, right? And going back to the idea of, the way we talk about people and the way we look at people, not as like needy or less than or incapable or vulnerable, but as capable adults, as human beings, right? Not just as like, this poor community that needs our help and that needs us to represent them, right? I think it all goes hand in hand with just really thinking about the experience, the lived experience of people, rather than how it relates to us and our work, right? And you're right. I mean, the privilege that we carry every day doesn't even let us understand what people are going through, right? Our economic security, right? Like if you're traveling in Europe, you know, chances are you've got some savings and you're not worried about living paycheck to paycheck, and you're not dealing with even remotely with what a refugee family would be dealing with here in the United States. So absolutely, thank you for saying that. And it's, you can't like have the conversation about social justice and about language justice without talking about the whole, which I think is the way our country treats people that are other, right? And that's something that I hope we can all work every single day to change, and never forget for 1 second that this is the reality, right? Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else have thoughts about, you know, how this can apply to your own work, or have you had experiences that you'd like to share in the past with English learners? Oksana, are you trying to talk to us, or I see? Okay, I just want to make sure. Sorry.
I would like to respond to, is it Oksana? Because I remember being in Mexico a number of years ago, and I took Spanish in college, and I was very good at it, very fluent. And then I became a school teacher and never spoke it again for many years. And when I went to Mexico for a vacation, I tried to relearn some of my Spanish, and we stayed at a resort, and there was a waiter who waited on us every day. And during the course of the week, he helped me learn some of my Spanish again. And when I would order, I would try to order in Spanish. So by the end of the visit, I was able to order in Spanish. And I was pretty proud of myself. And he was thrilled. And I just have to say, he was so patient and so accommodating and so willing to try to help me relearn that language, where what you're saying, the experience of Americans to people from other countries is the opposite. It's kind of sad, because I had a very, very happy experience trying to relearn the language that I had learned in college, and having someone who was so appreciative. All the people in the resort, when I was learning to speak, would just encourage me. And it's a shame that we don't reciprocate that in America. That's all.
Yeah, there's a book that I highly recommend to everybody called The Faraway Brothers. It was written to tell the story of two twin boys that immigrated from Guatemala as a result of gang violence, and what their experience was like. And it was told from their own perspective. Like, it was more of a like a biographical story, kind of like an inverse memoir, about how opposite the experience is for new Americans than what you just described, right? Like, it's just like you were saying, Oksana, like, people roll out the red carpet, and, you know, people want to help you, and people are interested in hearing your story, by and large, if you're an American and you travel abroad. And then we really just, you know, sometimes advocates and people who are well-meaning, we don't always extend that same respect to people, right? So checking our biases and really thinking about the way we think about the people we serve and the people we work with is really important.
Yeah, I think some of the worst, oh, I'm sorry, you were going to talk.
Oh, no.
I was going to say that some of the worst of it is that, you know, like, not only are we, you know, awful to people who are here, you know, trying to connect with us and actually doing their best at English, and just, you know, getting upset with them about that. But when we go to other countries, we are we as Americans generally get offended when other people don't speak English. Like, how dare you not know my language, you know? And that's like the worst type of person. And it just makes me so upset that like there are people who come to our country and they can actually speak like 4 languages fairly well. And we are just like, ugh, but you like messed up this English word. Why don't you learn my country's like language? It just upsets me, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I dislike the term limited English proficient so much. It's like, okay, so somebody is learning English, but man, they're learning a second language or a third language, you know? Like, that's impressive. That's a skill. That's something to be proud of, right? It's not a deficiency.
I just wanted to say something about the comment the former Spanish teacher made. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. And the fact is that, and this is not because I need to defend the United States, but just to point out to you that if a third or fourth generation Mexican American went back to Mexico and attempted to pick up Spanish and broke it up and stuff like that, that would very likely not get the same response as a visibly to them American tourist trying to recover their Spanish, because this kind of lack of acceptance of someone else's ability to speak another language properly, and I use that term in quotes, is not exclusive to the United States. The problem with English in particular in this country is that because as an economic power and as a political power, English has become the dominant language of many things and that wasn't the case before. So for which reason so many people around the world study English, whereas here, you know, fewer than 8% of people in college study foreign languages because they don't feel they have to. So it's a very different dynamic. This exists in different cultures as well, and it's a sort of inside outside, in group out group mentality.
Yeah, and I believe, Kenya, you're a heritage speaker, correct?
That's right. And I was gonna tell Oksana that I'm Cuban. I was born in Cuba, grew up in New York. Nobody thinks I'm Latina because they have a perception of what a Latino needs to look like. And so I'm not saying that I feel discriminated against in the sense that but I have felt like the outsider many times when I felt naturally like an insider in a group. And so it's just a lack of awareness, because especially Latinos can come in every race and all combinations thereof, because it's not a race.
Yeah.
So that's a particular issue. But I did want to thank Oksana for saying that it really, how your foreignness comes off in the United States is very much conditioned by how people perceive you racially and ethnically. If you're white and you have a charming accent, which of course there are some accents that are charming and others that are not, you're going to get a lot more leeway than if you're Asian or you look, you know, if you're a member of the African diaspora, or if you look somehow brown.
Yeah. And like, for example, my sister did her master's in TESOL. And so I betaed and proofread a lot of her papers. So I've read a lot of research, unfortunately. But your accent and the weight of it, quote unquote, has less effect on your understandability than what you look like. And so they did a whole bunch of blind tests about someone's English based on what was written, like verbatim what they spoke, and then seeing them speak. And on average, people were rated as having worse English when they were seen rather than when they were read, even if it was word for word exactly what was said. My sister is a lot darker than I am. And she's an American, just like me. Her husband is a white man from France. And whenever they go out together, people assume that he is the American and she is the immigrant when they say, yes, we're, you know, a multinational family. And so they always ask her, oh, so where are you from? And she's like, I'm from Brooklyn. Nice to meet you. And so that does play a huge role. And it is really, really important to recognize, even amongst the immigrant community, the English learning community, that you will have different experiences across the board. Like if you have an immigrant coming from Western Europe, their accent will be perceived from even someone in Eastern Europe and will be perceived completely differently than someone who is coming from a community of color. You know, I spent time abroad in Eastern Europe. I know how that accent is perceived. It's a very Slavic influenced accent, so people see that differently than they would see a lovely lilting French accent or a British accent. And that is completely different than how they would perceive someone from Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, or literally anywhere else.
Even a native speaker of English from a country where English is one of the native official languages, they will be perceived differently.
And there's, in the United States,
South
especially,
Asia, for example, you know,
the mistaken idea that there is a correct way to speak English. If you are a native speaker of English, there is no way that you can be wrong. It's just simply a dialectical difference, and a lot of people don't realize that and are very quick to dismiss Indian accents or accents from Hong Kong, Jamaica, you know, and if you're not one of the big three, like Britain, Australia, and the United States, your accent is somehow wrong. And Canada.
No, it's true. And I think like there's so much identity wrapped up in language too, which is another reason this like hits so close to home is, you know, the way you perceive yourself can be affected by the way other people treat you, obviously, and your language is like the face that you put onto the world. And like, you know, I see a lot of like, oh, coaching programs to help you lose your accent and, you know, things like that. And it just makes me so sad that this just wonderful, enriching part of human identity can be kind of turned against people and can help like cause people to be perceived as, you know, all of those adjectives that we shared before, right? As like less than or other or dumb or, you know, any of the things. And, you know, given that most people don't think about any of this from the perspective of language, I really appreciate this conversation because I have a soapbox that I could stand up on all day and talk about language access. So yeah, I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but I really appreciate all of your insights.
I have been nodding aggressively for most of this discussion, and I am really, really excited about it. I just want to take a few minutes to revisit the like closing call to action, and then afterwards I'm going to stop recording this conversation so it can continue on from there, and maybe folks who haven't been participating because they know it's recording could also have a chance to participate. But thank you so much, MJ, for all of this, and thank you so much to everyone who has joined us and who has participated. I am going to repaste the information about how you can support Mary Jayne's organization and company, Global Wordsmiths, and I am going to share my screen just briefly to show you where those links will take you. The first one is this honeycomb credit campaign. MJ didn't really talk about it too much, but I think after I'm finished sharing my screen, I'd love for her to talk a little bit about how the past few months and the pandemic has affected a lot of her work. Oh, there's our favorite MJ. I don't know if you can see my mouse circling her face over here. But much of the work that Global Wordsmiths was doing was event-based and was in person. They are raising or looking to raise $107,000 or 107, you know, this big number on honeycomb credit. They've already done a fantastic job of raising over $24,000, which is incredible, but they have 10 days left to meet their maximum raise goal. And one of the things that's really exciting about honeycomb credit is that this is not just a fundraising goal, but essentially the folks who are putting money towards this campaign are becoming investors in Global Wordsmiths, which, as you can see, they have 79 investors so far. So I don't know, but 8 is a lucky number where I'm from. If you want to be lucky number 80, you have that opportunity. You also have the opportunity to really become a big part of the work that Mary Jayne is doing and going to be continuing to do. This is a part of her team. These are all the interns that worked with her on the Language Access Project, we're going through training. And then in addition to being able to contribute financially through Honeycomb Credit, I had mentioned previously that I met MJ because she joined the platform that I work on, which is called Shine Registry. If you go to shineregistry.com and go to our registries page, there are a lot of different ways of exploring all the women-owned businesses that are represented on here. I just clicked Pittsburgh to look at all the Pittsburgh-based companies, of which there are a lot, including Global Wordsmiths. And so on MJ's Shine Registry profile, you can make the commitment to investing in their Honeycomb Credit campaign. You can also commit to non-monetary asks and other things that will support her company and support her work. So I'm doing all the social media things. I can't promise that I can help her take a nap, but I'm gonna check that off and do what I can at some point. Maybe I'll send you a pillow. And I'm also gonna endorse her skills on LinkedIn because I really loved this presentation. I wanna support her work. So I'm already signed into Shine Registry. So I'm just confirming my information here and hitting fulfill. And so MJ is going to get, what she's receiving is the information about how to follow up with me, which includes my email address, or she can just yell at me on this Zoom call after I stop sharing my screen. But thanks again, everybody. I am going to stop recording now.